we have two more wonderful speakers, and each is amazing. The first young man, all right, first of all, I love the name, Will Hill. That's kind of cool. Look at that. All right. But I asked him, what are you going to be talking about? And he just looked at me straight, was honest. He said, you ain't going to get none of this, bro. And I said, all right, bro, I appreciate you being honest with me, right? So I asked him, what do you do that's cool, right? And he said, and I quote, axe throwing. He throws axes. And not the spray. Not the spray. He don't just walk around and go in the store and throw some axe at people. He throws a true axe at people, right? Not at people.
Not at people.
Not at people
Not
yet.
at people.
But at the thing, and you make it stick in the wall. Have you gotten the bullseye thing yet?
Of course.
All right. But here's the most important thing. Come up here, bro, because we got to show them how we do this. Look, if y'all ain't going to come prepared, right? If y'all not going to come here ready to rock the red shoes, don't even play. All right? And my other brother. Come here, my other brother. Come here, man. Come here. We're going to show y'all. I'm wearing burgundy tomorrow, so I'm just letting y'all know. All right? Look at this. Look at this. Look at this, man. And these all grown shoe sizes, too. All of them. Ain't no children's sizes in here. We cool, but y'all all right. I like y'all. I like y'all. Look at that. Mac Daddy and Daddy of the Mac. And what I love the fact is, this dude who is clearly wearing his medium shirt, the need to throw an axe. Bro, why don't you just throw one of them arms?
I mean, I box too, so.
Of course you do. I'm done with you. All right. You box too. Look at me. I'm in great shape and I'm smart. Shut up. All righty. The rest of y'all, give your hands in a banging position for Mr. Will Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Franz, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Richard and Kayla for inviting me and allowing me. Born and raised in Mississippi, I've gotten to speak at conferences all over the country, but this is my first time getting to speak in Mississippi, so I'm very excited about this. So, without further ado, I'll jump into my content, and we're going to discuss global state management and React. So, we're going to introduce what global state management is. Then we're going to look at some of the different approaches you can take to doing global state management. And then we're going to look at 3 concrete approaches that you can take with global state management. So it's not an exhaustive look. There's obviously more cases, but we're going to focus on 3 particular cases and the particular use cases in which they're good for. And then we'll wrap it up. So choosing a global state management strategy is a very important, but can be a pretty tricky part of designing and building your application. So many of the challenges of designing modern web apps can come down to global, like state management problems. So if we think about many modern web frameworks, they're all built componentized, right? So we can think about everything that we see visually on the page as a component. So we can think about just a basic example is that we can have some type of header, we can have some type of sidebar, and we can have some type of middle main content area. Each one of those can be made up into its own separate. Each one of those components, that sidebar and that main content, can then further be built of smaller components. So all these different components that we're building, a lot of them will depend on some type of shared state to display correct components. You know, say if we have 10 components, 30 components, 50 components, we need some way that we can make sure that we're keeping track of state consistently and accurately so that all of those components can render properly. So for approaching this problem, we're going to look at 3 in particular and the use cases that they map closely with. So the 3 options we're going to look at are React Context, Redux, and Recoil. So as with anything, each one, there's the good things about them, and there are things that may not work so well. And we're going to evaluate the particular use case that they're good for and when they can be most advantageous, as well as those pitfalls that can come along with them. So we're going to look at it at a high level, and then we're also going to look at some very, very quick. So the first one we're looking at, and also I forgot to mention, maybe y'all picked this up, some of y'all who are familiar with old school hip hop. With React Context, that's the battery included way of doing baked right directly into the API. So React Context, what it allows you to do, it allows you to wrap your component tree in this context, and then every component that in that tree can access whatever particular object in that and context object. And we're going to go through an example to try to make that more. It allows you to avoid having to pass that use state. And now transit line lives in that component tree that we wrapped. We can just access it directly from there. So we avoid the prop drilling problem. So now within our JSX, we can conditionally render this div depending on the off-the-track variable. Because those of you that are familiar with the song, engine, a simple app using an external library such as Redux could be overkill. So this allows us to create a pretty simple way to avoid the prop drilling problem, where we can define this context at the top of our component tree and then access that state anywhere within that component tree. So if it's a small app, you have a fairly simple use case, this can be a good way to go. Now, the flip side of that, the downside is that it's good for simple cases, but if your app starts to grow and get more complex, then you can run into some issues. So consuming multiple contexts could be potentially messy. So right now, we only had one context. We only had that train context. But we wanted to add multiple other contexts. So one example you can think in a more real-world use case of this is, say, like authentication. But along with authentication, you also want to have like a locality context as far as time zones or anything like that. Or also you want to have your theme, whether it's a light theme or dark theme. So now you have 3 different contexts that you will have to wrap everything. So it can get kind of messy once you start to have more than one context. You can also only pass one value within a context. So in this case, we pass an object which could have multiple properties, but you can't pass multiple values, which you then can set up like different consumers for those different values. And also, one other pitfall is that we saw with that New York, wasn't using the context at all. But if you have multiple contexts, if you don't set up like memoization or anything, even those components that are not using the context will get re-rendered once the state changes. So you could have potentially a bunch of unnecessary re-renders if you don't set it up properly or take extra care to set up the context properly. So the next approach we're going to look at is Redux. So Redux is a predictable state container. So it's very closely associated with React just because it's so ubiquitous, but it can actually be used with other JavaScript libraries as well. So with Redux, we store the entire global state in an object tree, and we put it inside a single store to make that available to the rest of the application. So whenever actions or events happen within the application, we dispatch those actions to that store, and then that store will then take the previous state along with that action and derive the new state of the application. So I know that was a bunch of word vomit, but we're going to also do the same thing. We'll walk through an example to try to conceptualize it. Everyone still fine with the text, size of the text? Can read that fine? Cool. So we're going to write the same exact app. So to start to set this up, and one thing I want to point out for those who may be familiar with Redux, I'm using Redux Toolkit, which is a framework of like best practices to help you set up Redux and avoid some of the boilerplate and pain that vanilla Redux can throw your way. So we're going to use this concept called a slice. So first, we're setting up this initial state object where we're setting off the track to false. So we're setting up our same Boolean that we did before. And now we're creating this slice. So this slice is going to allow us to, it's going to be it's a nicety of Redux Toolkit that's going to generate some stuff for us. So we need to pass in a name. We pass in that initial state object that we just defined. And then we set up our reducers. So our reducers are pure functions that's going to operate on our state. So in this case, our toggle off the track. So this is going to toggle our Boolean to our true or false. And another nicety of using Redux Toolkit is that we can automatically generate our action creators off the slice. So if we were using vanilla Redux, we would have to write an additional function called an action creator. But with Redux Toolkit, we get that for free. And then we export this reducer. So from there, we set up our reducer. Now we set up our store. So in this case, we import that. So we import configure store from Redux Toolkit. We also import that reducer that we just wrote, and from there, we pass that in to configure store. So we just have one reducer here just for our train. So now if we go to our app.js, looks slightly different. In this case, we're not wrapping that component trigger to anything. So right now, we're just only calling that New York component. The New York component looks exactly the same, not accessing any state. All it's doing is essentially calling transit line. And then transit line is where things get interesting again. Let me adjust this so we can get more space to see everything. So within here, we're using two hooks from the React Redux library. So we have this use selector hook and this use dispatch hook. So the use selector hook will allow us to essentially hook into that store and grab a value from the store. So we want to grab the off-the-track value from the store using that use selector hook. And then the use dispatch hook, this is what I mentioned before we got into the example, is that whenever things happen in the application, we want to then dispatch an action to that store and then allow the store to calculate our new state from the previous state plus that action that we dispatched to it. So from here, doing just those two things I said, we use the use selector hook to get the value of off the track from the store, and then we set up this dispatch function that we're going to use in just a moment. And then our JSX looks just as it did before. We conditionally render depending on the value of off the track, and then we set up for our event handler on the onClick is that we then dispatch off the track, toggle off the track to the store. So again, we're currently on the track because that's false. We click that, and it updates. It sends it dispatches an action to Redux, and Redux updates our state, and we can toggle that. So same exact app as before, just now we're using Redux to handle the state. So the advantages of using Redux. As I mentioned, Redux is very closely associated with React a lot of times. So it is the de facto standard for using, for doing global state management within React. Given that it is the standard, it has a lot of tooling built around it for both development and debugging. And it also has a large community as far as different classes, tutorials, and just online help that you can find as far as using Redux. The downside is that it can have a pretty significant learning curve. So I remember when I was first trying to learn Redux, it took me a while to wrap my head around it, especially given that I was using vanilla Redux versus using Redux Toolkit. So it was a lot of boilerplate code that you had to set up to, we saw that we were able to set up our reducers in our store in only a few lines of code. If you're using vanilla Redux, can be significantly more challenging to get all that set up properly and before you can start to integrate that into your application. So the last approach we're going to look at is the new kid on the block. It's called Recoil. So Recoil is developed by Meta itself, same team or closely related teams that works on React itself. And it's an experimental state management library. So it allows you to create this data flow graph where data flows from atoms down through selectors into your actual components. And atoms are these pieces of state that your components can subscribe to, and then selectors are pure functions that can then transform that state either synchronously or asynchronously. So we'll do the same thing here. We're going to go to another code sandbox example where we're going to write that same exact app, but we're going to write it using Recoil. So as I mentioned in the slide, we start out with an atom. So that's how we can start to set up our state. So these are basically state objects that our components can subscribe to. So we import atom from Recoil, and then we set up our atom. And an atom must have a unique key. So in respect to other atoms and other selectors, the key has to be unique. So in this case, we call it off the track state. And then we can give it a default value. So then selectors as we mentioned, are these pure functions that can operate on these atoms, that can update the state of an atom. So not only can it update a state, but we can also derive data from the state of a given atom. So in this case, we import the atom that we just defined, and then we set up this selector. So a selector also has to have a unique key. In this case, we call it off-the-track message state. And then from there, we have this getter function. This is where we can then access the value that's in an atom. So we do this get, and we're getting the value from that off-the-track state atom that we define. So now we can actually, we can either one, operate on that state, where we can manipulate it, or in this case, we're actually deriving a new piece of data depending on the value of that state. So this should look somewhat familiar, right, where we say if off the track, then we return pick it up, pick it up, pick it up. So now if we go to our app in this case, we are wrapping our component tree. So that's a kind of a similarity between recoil and context. We have this recoil root component that we're getting from recoil, and we're wrapping our component tree in that. So then our component tree would be able to access the atoms and the selectors that we define. Looking at the New York component, again, same as before, essentially a pass-through component, only displaying data and then calling the transit line component. And now in the transit line component, let me try to make this a little wider. Now in the transit line component, this is where things get interesting again, where we're actually going to access the state and that selector from recoil. So we have a couple of hooks here that we get from recoil. We have the use recoil state and use recoil value. So use recoil state is for accessing the state that's stored within our atom. And then that use recoil value is for getting any type of derived data from a selector. And we also import the atom and, and the selector itself. Use recoil state, if you're familiar with React and have used use state, you see this has a similar API to use state. And that's one of the advantages, given that, developed by Meta itself, they were trying to make this idiomatic to React as possible. So you can see the API is pretty similar. So use recoil state, we pass in that atom, and then we're able to get the value of that atom, and then we're able to set up a setter function. And then from using use recoil value, we pass in that selector, and we're able to get back that message that we derived within that selector. And then we set up this toggle function that allows us to toggle the state of off the track. So I'm going to make a little change here. So with this line, this is the same line of code we've used across all three apps, right? Where we just check and say, what's the state of off the track? And then we conditionally render that div. But if we remember what we did in that selector, we've already done that part, because that selector allows you to derive data from the state. So we don't have to do that part in the JSX anymore, where we're checking to conditionally render that particular div. We've already, we already have this where we can derive the state or derive this piece of data from the state. So instead of doing that, we can simply just print out the value of off the track message, because if off the track is true, then in that selector, it's going to set, the message there is going to set that string, but that selector is also subscribed to that atom. So the value of that atom change, then that selector is going to derive a new piece of data. So if that is false, it just will return nothing. And just the same. So the advantages of using recoil. We saw that it has just like we talked about, use recoil state and use state, it has a very similar API. It's written to work very closely just like native, even though it is technically an external library, it's written to work very like native React. But then we saw how we can also derive data from a minimal set of state. So in that case, we didn't have to worry about trying to check the state of that variable within the JSX. We were able to just do it directly in the selector. So a downside, it's a new kid on the block. It's still, even within Meta's like GitHub page, it's still marked as experimental. So it's not something, potentially maybe ready for production use because it could have a bunch of breaking changes. You just never know, at this point, with it being experimental, where the API is going to go. So it's kind of used at your own risk at this point. And also, given that it's new, it's just going to have fewer resources out there. Like one of the advantages we talked about at Redux, given that it's so ubiquitous, it has a lot of resources and guides out there in places that you can go and find information. This one is a lot newer, so you're going to kind of be a little bit more on your own as far as trying to figure out things. Excuse me. So you may say, okay, well, what's the best choice? It depends. I know that's a sucky answer, but really that is the answer. It depends. You got to evaluate your use cases and see like, okay, which one of these would be most advantageous to me? Because if you're trying to write a large production application, enterprise application, using context probably wouldn't be the best choice for you. So you just have to kind of be able to evaluate what would be the best case for my particular app, and then what may be the best case one day may not be the best case the next day. Context may work for you great starting out, but as you start to grow and scale, it may not be the right choice for you. So it really depends, and the choice is yours. And that's all I have.